100,000 children walk into courtrooms every single year. Most leave unseen. But on a Tuesday in March, a 3-year-old girl would say 5 words that stopped a sentencing judge cold. A mother's fate was sealed. A gavel was about to fall, until the janitor's daughter, with no lawyer and no training, did what no official appeal could. This is the true story of Judge Evelyn Reed and a defendant named Maria Flores. It's a case about a broken law, a broken home, and the moment a child's innocence collided with the absolute power of the bench. How does a system built on precedent and procedure respond when the most compelling testimony comes from someone who can't even read the charges? To understand that collision, you first have to understand the 2 women whose lives were already hanging by a thread long before that Tuesday. Judge Evelyn Reed's day began at 5:15, a full 2 hours before her courtroom opened. She moved through her empty house with the same precision she demanded of her court. Coffee, black, briefs reviewed, every sentence, every precedent in its proper place. It was a life built on order, a fortress against chaos. And on the other side of the city, chaos was exactly what Maria Flores was trying to outrun. Maria worked the overnight shift at a commercial laundry. The air was thick with steam and bleach, and her hands were permanently raw. She had been in the country for 8 years, paid taxes, kept her head down. But a year ago, her brother had been deported. In the frantic scramble that followed, Maria, who spoke limited English, had signed paperwork for a small loan to help his family. The paperwork, it turned out, was fraudulent. She was arrested for aggravated identity theft, a federal charge. The public defender told her the mandatory minimum was 2 years. 2 years. Lena was 3. This is where their paths first crossed, in the sterile paperwork of the district court. Case number 17 CR 20341. The United States versus Maria Flores, presiding Judge Evelyn Reed. To the court, Maria was a defendant who had pleaded guilty. A file, a sentencing guideline. To Judge Reed, she was one of 47 cases on the docket that month. But this one had a victim impact statement. A detailed, angry letter from the man whose identity was stolen, demanding the maximum punishment. The guidelines were clear. The pressure from the U.S. Attorney's Office was clear. Judge Reed had a reputation for being fair, but also for being unwavering. She believed the law was a scaffold, and if you started bending it for one person, the whole structure was at risk. Meanwhile, in the same courthouse, another life orbited the edges of this drama. Henry Watkins was the head night janitor. He had worked there for 11 years. He started his shift at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., polishing miles of marble floor, emptying the trash cans of judges and clerks, watching the quiet aftermath of justice. His wife had passed away from pneumonia 2 winters before, and his childcare, a patchwork of favors from a weary sister, had finally collapsed. That March, he had no choice. He began bringing his daughter, Chloe, to work. He would settle her on a padded bench in a quiet custodial closet near the basement, with her blanket and a picture book. She was supposed to sleep until his shift ended at 6. She was 3 years old. So every night, the courthouse held 3 people whose lives were converging, none of them aware of the others. Judge Reed in her chambers under the weight of the law. Maria in a detention center under the weight of her fear. And Henry pushing a wax buffer over the courthouse seal inlaid in the floor, under the weight of simply keeping his child safe. For Maria, the days blurred into a cycle of panic and paralysis. The only thing that mattered was Lena, who would take her. Her sister was undocumented and terrified of any contact with the system. A friend from the laundry had offered, but her apartment was already overcrowded. Child services was a specter that haunted Maria's few moments of sleep. She pleaded with her public defender. Is there anything, any program, any mercy? The defender, overworked and pragmatic, would shake his head. The guidelines are the guidelines, Maria. The judge has discretion, but with the victim impact statement, he'd trail off. The message was clear. Hope was not a legal strategy. Judge Reed reviewed the Flores pre-sentence report on a Thursday evening. She read the victim's statement about the credit damage, the hours spent repairing his life. She read the prosecution's memo highlighting the need for deterrence. She read the defense's plea for mercy, citing Maria's clean record, her employment, the sole custody of a toddler. She saw the photo of Lena attached to the defense filing, a little girl with dark curls, smiling. Judge Reed set the photo aside. She was not supposed to be swayed by a photograph. The law was not about sympathy, it was about justice. She calculated the sentencing range, 24 to 30 months. She leaned toward 24. It was fair. It was by the book. She made a note in the margin. Henry's routine was fracturing. Chloe was a light sleeper. The courthouse at night was silent, but it was a vast, echoing silence full of strange clicks and distant humming. She would wake disoriented and come looking for him. He'd find her standing in the doorway of some dark courtroom, her blanket dragging on the floor. He'd scoop her up, shush her, take her back to the closet. But he was running out of ways to explain. Don't go in the courtrooms, baby. Those are the judge's rooms. We don't belong in there. The week before the sentencing, Maria was allowed a video visit with Lena. Her sister brought the girl to a visitation center. Lena pressed her small hands against the glass. Mama, when you come home. Maria forced a smile. Soon, baby. Be good for Tia. After the visit, she sat on the cold floor of her cell and wept silently until her throat was raw. She had signed the plea. There was no trial. All that was left was for the judge to pronounce the sentence. The system had moved, step by logical step, toward an inevitable conclusion. The morning of March 12th, a Tuesday, arrived. Judge Reed, dressed with care, black robe, pearl studs, hair in its impeccable bun. She felt the familiar weight of responsibility. Today, she would give Maria Flores 24 months. It was correct. It was just. She walked into her chambers at 7 sharp. Henry's shift had ended at 6, but his sister was late again. He couldn't leave Chloe alone in the car. He pleaded with his supervisor, who sighed and said, "Just keep her in the break room, Henry. Don't let her wander." The public defender's break room was on the 3rd floor near the courtrooms. It had a sofa and a vending machine. Henry sat Chloe there with a juice box. "You sit right here, Chloe. Daddy has to finish one thing, then we go." He had to restock the paper towels in the judge's hallway bathrooms. It would take 10 minutes, 15 tops. He pointed a finger at her. Right here. At 8:45, Maria Flores, in an orange jumpsuit, her wrists and ankles shackled, was led into the holding cell behind Judge Evelyn Reed's courtroom. She was trembling. A deputy marshal said, "Flores, you're up in 15. Your lawyer will meet you inside." At 8:50, Judge Reed entered courtroom number 4. The gallery was sparse. A few law students, a probation officer. The air was cool still. She took her seat high on the bench, arranged her papers, and nodded to the clerk. "All rise. The United States District Court for the District is now in session, the Honorable Evelyn Reed presiding." Maria's public defender, looking rushed, met her at the defense table. He whispered, "Just remember, be respectful. Say you're sorry when she asks." The prosecutor adjusted his tie. The routine was set. The clerk called the case. 17 CR 20341, United States versus Maria Flores for sentencing. The judge's voice was calm, measured. She began the formalities. The prosecution spoke about the seriousness of the crime. The defense spoke about Maria's character. Maria, when asked, stood on shaky legs and whispered, "I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to help my family." Judge Reed listened. She looked down at the sentencing memorandum. She had already decided. She began to speak, explaining the reasoning, moving toward the pronouncement. Maria closed her eyes. And in that moment, the heavy door at the back of the courtroom, the one that led to the judge's private hallway, creaked open. No one ever entered that way during session. It was against every rule. But Henry, finishing his task, had turned to find the break room empty. A juice box sat half-finished on the sofa. Panic had shot through him. He had run down the hall, his heart hammering, checking rooms. And a small figure in a yellow dress had already found the one door that wasn't locked. Judge Evelyn Reed paused mid-sentence. Every eye in the courtroom turned. And a little girl, barely taller than the bench, walked into the center of the silent courtroom. looked up at the woman in black and spoke. She looked up at the woman in black and in a voice clear as water said, "Please don't take her mommy." 5 words. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums. Every person in that room stopped breathing. Judge Evelyn Reed, her sentence hanging unfinished in the air, stared down at the child. It was the marshal by the door who moved first. A sharp intake of breath, a step forward. His hand went to his belt, not to a weapon, but an instinctual motion to restore order. This was not procedure. This was an invasion. The little girl, Chloe, didn't flinch. She just stood there, one hand holding the hem of her yellow dress, waiting for an answer. And in that suspended second, Judge Reed did something utterly unscripted. She held up a single hand, palm out, toward the marshal. "Stop." The gesture was small, but in the hierarchy of the courtroom it was a quake. The marshal froze. The prosecutor's pen hovered over his legal pad. Maria Flores at the defense table turned her head slowly, the chains at her wrists giving a soft clink. Her eyes were wide with a confusion so deep it bordered on terror. This was not her daughter. Who was this child? Judge Reed's mind, usually a cascade of precedent and analysis, went blank for one pure white moment. All she saw was the girl, the coily puffs of hair, the simple dress, the utter lack of fear. "Please don't take her mommy." The words weren't even legally correct. Maria Flores was not this child's mother. And yet they pierced the formal atmosphere of the courtroom with the directness of a needle. They were not an argument. They were a plea. The most fundamental plea there is. Then the door burst open again. Henry Watkins stood in the doorway, his custodial uniform a stark contrast to the dark wood and suits, his face ashen with panic. "Chloe, I am so sorry, Your Honor, she got away from me. I just turned my back for a second." His voice cracked. He looked from his daughter to the judge on the bench, a man caught between 2 forms of authority, both of which could destroy his life. The courtroom was now a diorama of shattered protocol. Judge Reed looked from the terrified janitor to the confused defendant to the child who had started it all. The legal machinery had ground to a halt. She knew the rules. She could have the marshal remove them both, gavel for order, and proceed. That was what the book said. But the book did not have a chapter for this. "Approach the bench," Judge Reed said, her voice quieter than before but no less firm. She was not speaking to the lawyers. She was speaking to Henry. He hurried forward, pulling Chloe with him, stopping at the wooden barrier before the bench. "Your name?" "Henry Watkins, Your Honor. I work nights. I clean here. I'm so sorry." "And this is your daughter?" "Yes, ma'am, Chloe. She's 3. My sitter fell through. I had no choice. Judge Reed held up her hand again. The explanation was unnecessary. She could see the truth of it in the weariness around his eyes, in the way his hand trembled on his daughter's shoulder. She looked down at Chloe. "Young lady," she said, and her tone shifted, not quite to a voice for a child, but something less formal. "Do you know where you are?" Chloe looked around, then back up. "Daddy's work." "And do you know who I am?" Chloe studied the black robe, the serious face. She pointed a small finger. "You're the boss lady." A faint, almost imperceptible ripple went through the gallery. The prosecutor coughed into his fist. Judge Reed did not smile. "In a manner of speaking, why did you come in here?" Chloe's brow furrowed as if the answer was obvious. She pointed at Maria. "She looks sad, like my mommy in the picture." Henry flinched, his eyes closing for a second. The reference to his late wife hung in the air, a private grief now exposed in a public forum. Judge Reed absorbed this. The child had seen a woman in chains, seen sorrow, and had responded with a child's logic. Sorrow must mean missing your mommy. The wrong mommy, but the right emotion. It was a devastatingly simple equation. She looked past them to Maria Flores. The defendant was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Not for herself, but for the sheer, bizarre kindness of a stranger's child. The photo of Lena was on the defense table. 2 children, now invisibly linked in this room. "Mr. Watkins," Judge Reed said, her decision made. "Take your daughter and wait outside my chambers. The deputy will show you. "Counsel," she said, turning to the lawyers. "Approach." The attorneys moved quickly to the sidebar, a hushed conference away from microphones. The prosecutor spoke first, a frantic whisper. "Your Honor, this is a highly improper interruption. The defendant's sentencing should proceed. This spectacle has no bearing on the guidelines." The public defender, seeing a sliver of daylight, seized it. "Your Honor, it has every bearing. It speaks to the human cost, the collateral damage the system often ignores. That child saw what we sometimes become numb to." Judge Reed cut through it. "I am adjourning this sentencing. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began. "Tomorrow, Counselor," she said, her tone leaving no room. She turned back to the courtroom. "Court is adjourned." She did not wait for the gavel's echo to fade before she stood and exited through the door behind the bench, her robe sweeping around her. The dam broke. A buzz of conversation erupted. Marshals moved to guide Maria away. Henry scooped up Chloe and hurried out, following a deputy. In her chambers, Judge Reed did not sit at her desk. She stood at the window, looking down at the city. The order of her day, of her life, had been fractured. A 3-year-old had walked in and asked a question the law was never designed to answer. What do you do when the right sentence feels wrong? She thought about the boss lady comment. She thought about the photo of Lena Flores. She thought about the mandatory minimum, a number decided by legislators far from this courtroom. For the first time in a long time, the weight of her robe felt different. It felt less like armor and more like a chain. Across the hall, in a small, plain waiting room, Henry held Chloe on his lap, shaking. He was sure he would be fired, maybe arrested. He whispered to her, "Why, baby? Why did you go in there?" Chloe, playing with a button on his uniform, said simply, "The sad lady needed a hug." In the holding cell, Maria wept into her hands. The delay was not hope. It was just more torture. Now, on top of everything, she was entangled in some strange drama with a janitor and his little girl. The system was a maze, and she was more lost than ever. But Judge Evelyn Reed was already pulling files, not the Flores case file. She had memorized that. She was pulling up sentencing disparity studies, reading academic papers on the unintended consequences of mandatory minimums on families. She was looking for a thread, a legal loophole, a precedent, anything that the boss lady could use to reconcile the law with the plea she'd just heard. The child had given her a night, one night to reconsider a decision 2 years in the making. The pressure was no longer just from the U.S. Attorney's Office or the sentencing guidelines. It was from a deeper place, a place she had walled off long ago. And that pressure was about to trigger a chain reaction that would leak far beyond her chambers, drawing in the media, the public, and forces that would turn one judge's crisis of conscience into a national debate. By 10 o'clock that night, the story was already leaking. It started as a blind item on a legal blog, a dramatic interruption in a federal sentencing today, a child in the courtroom, a judge's unprecedented pause. By midnight, a court clerk had confirmed the details to a reporter. By morning, the story had a name, the Courthouse Girl, and it was about to detonate. Judge Reed worked until 3 a.m. She found it, Rule 35. A motion to correct or reduce a sentence, typically filed by the prosecution for substantial assistance. But there was a lesser-known provision, a residual clause allowing a judge, on her own motion, to reduce a sentence if it was found to be manifestly unjust due to circumstances not adequately considered by the guidelines. It was a legal Hail Mary, almost never used post-sentencing, and she hadn't even sentenced yet. But it was a thread. She could postpone, call for a new presentence investigation focusing on familial impact, and then potentially invoke it. It was a path, but it was a path lined with professional dynamite. She didn't know that Henry Watkins was sitting in his dark apartment, staring at a voicemail from the courthouse facilities manager. His voice was clipped, formal. "Henry, we need to talk about yesterday's incident. Come in at 8 a.m. Do not bring your daughter." Henry knew what that meant. He looked at Chloe, asleep on the couch, and felt a wave of shame so acute it was physical. He had one job: keep her safe, keep her unseen. He had failed. The rent was due in 16 days. At 7 a.m., a news van parked outside the federal courthouse. By 7:30, there were three. The producer had dug up Maria's name and charge. The narrative was too perfect. Immigrant mom faces prison. Courthouse janitor's child pleads for mercy. It was national by 8. The chief judge of the district, Arthur Bromley, saw the headline on his iPad over breakfast. His phone rang before he took his first sip of coffee. It was a senior senator from the state, a man known for being tough on crime. "Arthur, what in God's name is happening in your courthouse? This is a circus. It makes the whole judiciary look soft." Judge Reed walked into the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras. She could feel the altered atmosphere, the glances from other staff, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. In her chambers, her clerk handed her a printed email from Chief Judge Bromley. "Evelyn, my office, 9:15. No subject line, no pleasantries. It was a summons." The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Bromley, a jurist with 30 years on the bench, did not raise his voice. "Evelyn, you've created an impossible situation. The press is painting you as either a saint or a fool. The U.S. Attorney's Office is furious. They're preparing an emergency writ if you deviate from the guidelines, arguing you've been unduly influenced. You know the rules. The sentencing guidelines exist for a reason: consistency, deterrence." Judge Reed sat very straight. "I am aware of the guidelines, Arthur. I am also aware of my obligation to consider all relevant factors under 18 U.S.C. Section 3553. The child's interruption was improper, but it highlighted a factor the presentence report minimized: the catastrophic familial disruption. I am considering a continuance to develop the record." Bromley removed his glasses. "Evelyn, don't make this your hill to die on. This defendant pleaded guilty. The guidelines are clear. The victim impact statement is compelling. You start bending for a sympathetic story and every sentencing becomes a soap opera. Sentence her today, put this to bed." It wasn't advice. It was an order. Meanwhile, in the basement, Henry Watkins was being formally suspended without pay, pending a review of his conduct unbecoming a court employee. The facility's manager slid the paperwork across the desk. "You brought a child into a secure area, Henry. She interrupted a federal proceeding. The judge may be lenient, but we cannot be. The security office is involved." Henry signed the paper, his hand numb. He had $90 in his bank account. He walked out of the courthouse into the glare of the cameras. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Mr. Watkins, what did you say to the judge? Are you a friend of the defendant?" Henry, bewildered, put a hand over his face and pushed through, finding Chloe waiting with a social worker from a victims advocacy group who had temporarily taken charge of her. The little girl was crying. "Daddy, why are the cameras here?" It was the photo that would be on the front page the next day. The janitor and his daughter besieged. Back in her chambers, Judge Reed stared at the family photo on her own desk: herself, her late husband, their daughter, taken years ago at a beach. Her husband had died of a sudden heart attack when their daughter was in college. Her daughter now lived in London, distant in more than miles. She thought of the word family as a legal concept, as a mitigating factor. It was abstract. Then she thought of Henry Watkins's panic, of Maria Flores's tears, of Chloe's 5 words. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was a roaring in her ears. At that moment, her clerk buzzed in, voice tense. "Judge, the U.S. Attorney is on line 1. He says it's urgent." She picked up. The prosecutor's voice was cold, professional, and lethal. "Judge Reed, we've been made aware of your communications with the chief judge. We wanted to inform you formally that if you pursue a downward variance outside the guidelines, we will immediately file a writ of mandamus with the circuit court, seeking your recusal from this and all future criminal cases on the grounds of prejudice. We believe the incident yesterday has created an appearance of partiality." They were threatening to have her removed from the bench for this case. They were playing for keeps. She hung up. The room was very quiet. She had 2 choices. She could follow Bromley's order, give Maria Flores 24 months, and watch the system swallow 2 families whole. Or she could follow the thread of Rule 35, step into the unknown, and potentially lose her judgeship, her life's work in the process. The law was supposed to be a shield against chaos, but what if the law was the chaos? At 2 p.m., she entered a packed courtroom. Every seat was filled. Maria Flores sat at the defense table looking smaller than ever. The prosecutor sat rigid, a stack of fresh motions at his elbow. The air crackled. Judge Reed took the bench. She did not look at the gallery. She looked at Maria. "We are here to resume the sentencing of Maria Flores. Before we proceed, I have a question for the prosecution." She turned her gaze to the U.S. attorney. "Does the government believe that the potential orphanhood of a 3-year-old child, her placement into the foster care system, is a relevant factor under Section 3553? Yes or no?" The prosecutor stood, caught off guard. "Your Honor, the guidelines account for family ties and responsibilities. They are not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The crime must be punished." "That is not an answer to my question," Judge Reed said, her voice like ice. "Is it a relevant factor?" "It is one factor among many, Your Honor." "Thank you." She then looked at the public defender. "Does the defense have any further evidence to present regarding the specific, likely fate of the defendant's daughter, Lena Flores, should this court impose a custodial sentence?" The public defender stood, fumbling with a new file. We have a statement from the sister, reiterating she cannot take the child, and a letter from a social worker outlining the high probability of entry into the state system, given the lack of viable kin. "I see." Judge Reed paused. The entire room leaned forward. She was deviating from the script, and everyone knew it. "I am, at this time, continuing this sentencing hearing for 30 days. An audible gasp went through the courtroom. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we object. This is highly irregular. The defendant has been awaiting sentencing for months." "My reasoning," Judge Reed continued, overriding him, "is to allow for the completion of a supplemental presentence report to be conducted by the probation office, focusing exclusively on the detailed custodial and psychosocial ramifications for the defendant's dependent child. I am invoking my discretionary authority under Rule 32 to ensure the court has the fullest possible picture." She was using a procedural rule to buy time. It was a legal maneuver, but it was a declaration of war. The prosecutor's face flushed red. "Your Honor, the government will be seeking immediate review of this order." "You are free to do so, Counselor," Judge Reed said. She then turned to Maria. "Ms. Flores, you will remain in custody pending the completion of this report. Court is adjourned." She stood and left the bench, the roar of the gallery swelling behind her. But the real explosion happened an hour later. As Henry Watkins was packing his locker in the basement, a young, ambitious reporter from the city's biggest newspaper found him. She didn't ask about the case. She asked about Chloe, about his wife, about bringing a child to work because you have no other choice. Henry, raw and desperate, told her everything. The article went online at 5 p.m. It wasn't about the law. It was about a little girl who missed her mom and a dad trying to do right and a judge who listened. The public, reading it, didn't see legal procedure. They saw a human story, and they took sides violently. By 8 p.m., the chief judge's office had been flooded with calls. Half demanded Judge Reed's resignation. Half hailed her as a hero. The U.S. Attorney's Office released a fiery statement about the rule of law. Advocacy groups for prisoners' families began organizing vigils for Maria. A national debate erupted on cable news, mercy versus mandates. And at the center of it all was a 3-year-old girl who had said 5 words. The institution was now at war with itself, and Judge Evelyn Reed had just stepped into the no-man's land between them. The next move would not be a legal one. It would be something far more powerful, and it would come from the most unlikely place of all. The 30 days that followed were a pressure cooker, but the heat did not come from where Judge Reed expected. It came from the victim, the man whose identity Maria Flores had stolen, whose angry letter had been the prosecution's cornerstone, was watching the news, and he was changing his mind. His name was Robert Kearns. He was a 62-year-old retired teacher in Ohio. He had spent months fixing his credit, furious at the faceless criminal who had upended his life. But as he watched the story unfold, the janitor's daughter, the judge's pause, the detailed reporting on Maria's life and her own little girl, his anger began to curdle into something else. He saw his own granddaughter in the pictures of Lena. He saw the fear in Henry Watkins's eyes and recognized the look of a parent in over their head. On the morning of day 15, he called the U.S. Attorney's office. He asked to amend his victim impact statement. The prosecutor who took the call was stunned. Kieran said, "I don't want her to go to prison for 2 years. I want her to pay me back, and I want her to take care of her kid." He had done the math. Maria in prison meant the state supporting her daughter. Maria working meant a chance at restitution. It was practical, moral, and it completely undercut the prosecution's argument. The office refused to file the amended statement. It was, they said, irrelevant to the sentencing guidelines. But the fact of the call leaked, and when it did, the public narrative tipped decisively. Judge Reed, operating under the threat of the writ, worked with the probation officer on the supplemental report. They documented the foster care system's overcrowding, the statistical likelihood of Lena being placed in a series of homes, the trauma of separation. It was a dry, clinical document that described a potential human catastrophe. The probation officer, a woman named Susan Gray with 20 years of experience, handed the report to Judge Reed and said, "In my career, I've never seen a clearer case of a sentence destroying 2 lives for one nonviolent crime." It was an extraordinary, off-the-record moment. Meanwhile, the chief judge, Arthur Bromley, was facing his own crisis. The editorial boards of major newspapers were praising Judge Reed's courage. Petitions supporting her circulated online. The circuit court, where the writ of mandamus would be filed, sent a subtle signal. They were reluctant to step into a media firestorm unless absolutely necessary. The political pressure from the senator eased as polls showed public opinion favored mercy. Bromley called Judge Reed into his office again. This time, he didn't give an order. He asked a question. "Can you find a legal path that doesn't burn this building down?" She had it. The supplemental report gave her the circumstances not adequately considered. Rule 35 was her vehicle, but she needed one more thing, a way for the prosecution to save face. That came from an unexpected compromise. The public defender, inspired by Robert Kearns's change of heart, proposed a novel restitution plan. Maria would be sentenced to time served, followed by 3 years of supervised release with the condition that she maintain employment and pay a percentage of her earnings directly to Kearns. It was a punishment, but one that kept a family intact. The U.S. Attorney's Office, now isolated and facing a sympathetic victim, blinked. They agreed not to file the writ if Judge Reed stayed within the sentencing range. Time served was at the very bottom, but it was still within the range. It was a fig leaf, but it was enough. The final sentencing hearing was closed to the public. Only the parties were present. There were no cameras. Judge Reed took the bench. She looked at Maria Flores. "Ms. Flores, this court has considered the guidelines, the supplemental report, the victim's amended wishes, and the need for just punishment. The sentence of this court is time served, with credit for the 180 days you have already been incarcerated. You will be placed on supervised release for 36 months, under the strict condition that you maintain employment and pay restitution as outlined. You will be released today into the custody of immigration authorities for their determination on your status. Do you understand?" Maria stared, uncomprehending, until her public defender whispered in her ear. Then her hands flew to her mouth. She sobbed, nodding. "Yes, Your Honor, thank you." Judge Reed did not smile. She simply said, "I hope you understand the second chance you have been given. Do not waste it. court is adjourned. Maria Flores was released that afternoon. She was picked up by immigration, but given her clean record and the extraordinary circumstances, she was eventually granted a stay of removal. She got her job back at the laundry. Her first check included a small deduction for Robert Kearns. She and Lena were reunited in a small apartment provided by a local church. The story, for them, was a miracle. For Henry Watkins, the outcome was different. The courthouse administration, under continued scrutiny, reinstated him but transferred him to a maintenance facility across town, a demotion with less pay. He accepted it gratefully. The media attention led to a local charity setting up a childcare fund for courthouse employees. Chloe got a spot in a subsidized preschool. Henry still worked nights, but now he could sleep knowing she was safe. The photo of him and Chloe leaving the courthouse became a symbol, not of scandal, but of the hidden struggles of working people. And for Judge Evelyn Reed, the legal community was divided. Some colleagues praised her integrity. Others quietly removed her from their lunch lists. She received a formal, private censure from the Judicial Conduct Board for the procedural irregularities, but no further action. The courthouse girl case became a footnote in law school discussions on judicial discretion, but something in her had shifted. She began volunteering once a month at a legal clinic for low-income families. She never spoke about the case, she just listened. The surprising detail emerged a year later. Robert Kearns, the victim, had received his first restitution check from Maria Flores. It was for $87.50. He framed it. He told a reporter, "This is worth more than any prison sentence. It means she's working. It means her kid is with her. It means the system remembered it's made of people." He used the story in talks he gave to his local Rotary Club about forgiveness. The case left a permanent mark. A bipartisan bill was introduced in the state legislature, named Lena's Law, requiring family impact assessments for nonviolent offenders with dependent children. It didn't pass, but it started a conversation. One afternoon in the fall, Judge Reed was walking through the courthouse plaza. She saw Henry Watkins in his new facility uniform cleaning the windows of a neighboring building. He saw her, paused, and then gave a small, respectful nod. She returned it. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In the end, the law had not changed. The guidelines remained. But in one courtroom, for one defendant, the human calculus had been allowed to weigh in the balance. It did not fix the system. It simply proved that within its rigid framework, a crack of light could still get in, sometimes carried by the most unexpected of voices. The story of the judge and the janitor's daughter fades from the headlines, but it lingers in the quiet moments of discretion, in the memory of 5 words that reminded a room full of experts about the cost they had stopped seeing. And that is where the real work of justice continues. So what do we do with a story like this? Do we file it away as a rare exception, a fluke in the machinery? Or do we let it ask us the harder question? How many sentences are handed down every day where the true cost remains unseen, unspoken, because no one unexpected walks through the door? The law must be steadfast. It must be predictable. But this story reminds us that justice is not the same thing as the law. Justice is what happens in the space between the rule and the human being it affects. It is the momentary hesitation of a judge, the changed heart of a victim, the stubborn love of a father, and the unscripted words of a child who simply saw sadness and named it. We build systems to manage complexity, to be fair by treating everyone the same. But sometimes, fairness requires seeing the differences. It requires acknowledging that a number, 24 months, is not just a number. It is a birthday missed, a bedtime story gone untold, a slow unraveling of a life too young to understand why. The power of Chloe's 5 words wasn't in their legality. It was in their humanity. They forced everyone in that room for just a moment to see the defendant not as a case file, but as a mother. And that shift in perspective, however brief, changed everything. This isn't an argument against consequences. It's an argument for clarity, for looking at the full cost, not just the one tallied by the statute. The most profound legacy of that Tuesday in March may be that it challenges us to look for the hidden figures in every equation. The children, the families, the quiet struggles happening just outside the frame of the official record. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion is not weakness but a deeper form of strength, then you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to the narratives that operate in those crucial spaces, between power and powerlessness, between procedure and grace. We believe the stories worth telling are often the ones that never make the front page, the quiet moments of courage and connection that redefine what's possible. We don't do sensationalism. We don't do easy answers. We sit with the complexity, just like Judge Reed sat with that impossible choice. And there are so many more stories like this waiting to be heard. Stories of resilience, of unexpected mercy, of the small acts that bend the arc of a life. So if you want to stay with us for that journey, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Become part of a community that values depth over clicks and humanity over headlines. Tell us in the comments, when have you witnessed a moment of unexpected grace that changed an outcome? Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that light can get in, even through the smallest crack. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. Remember, the world is changed not only by grand declarations, but by a single, brave, small voice asking a simple question. Keep listening for them.